Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening, albeit virtually. We're very happy to have our speaker and be able to welcome you this evening. Oh, sorry. And to think I've done this enough times, you think I would have all the technical bits sorted out, but there's always a surprise. Okay, we're good to go now. Good evening. Thank you again for joining. A little bit of housekeeping before you get too far along. For those who haven't joined before, you're very welcome to send any questions or comments in the YouTube chat. We will make sure that we read those off at the end of the presentation to David. And then, of course, you're also welcome to send questions by email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. I will put that email address in the chat, so keep an eye on it. I will be monitoring the emails for any questions that are submitted that way. I would like to welcome Rob Crothers, Commodore at the Kingston Yacht Club, to welcome us this evening and say a few words. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. My name is Robert Crothers. I'm Commodore of KYC, at least until tomorrow when we have our AGM. On behalf of the members of KYC, I want to say how much we appreciate our relationship with the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes. Not only do we share members, we share a love of the marine history in Canada. Looking forward to the talk tonight, trying to understand how maps of the Great Lakes were developed. We also share an appreciation of the importance of marine activities on the Great Lakes, both past and present. We also consider the environmental health of the Great Lakes key to the health of those who live along the shore like us. And I wanted to mention that I know that you can go to the museum, but can you go to the Kingston Yacht Club? And yes, you can. We're going to try and work out a relationship that's a little bit more formalized, but we have a guest pass that you can access through members of KYC, which allows you to come onto the site, enjoy the bar and our food service, or just hang out. So that's something that Michelle and the Marine Museum and I are going to work out together in the near future. So having said that, I'm looking forward to the talk tonight, David. Over to you, or back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, a long-standing partnership there that we are very much looking forward to working with, continuing into the future. I see you're wearing your 125th anniversary jacket there. So if anyone didn't catch David Moore's presentation last spring, you can certainly still access that on our YouTube page. Thank you for joining our Marine Museum and Kingston Yacht Club Nautical Nights speaker series. This is the 5th one of this particular series. We have one more after it. Before I get too far along, I just wanted to, I would be remiss in not saying that apparently today is National Puppy Day. And so for anyone who hasn't kept track of our museum or social, you may not know that we have a museum dog that's quite often with us. And so we're just a little shout out to her because she was quite disappointed when I almost missed it. All right, so the waterways and land located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston acknowledges the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat of the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy. We thank these nations for the care and stewardship over this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. As you know, the topic for tonight's presentation is Admiral Henry Wolsey Bayfield, Royal Navy, who was a master chartmaker on the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River, and Gulf of the St. Lawrence, a very large geographic area to cover. And I couldn't help but think about our last presentation, which was Indigenous and French relations, but also talked a little bit about maps and the development of maps around that particular time and the exploration that's happened in and around the Great Lakes and towards the Western Sea. So this seems quite fitting that we're actually now moving and talking now about the British time during in and around the Great Lakes and the map making that began during that time. So David Yates is a semi-retired teacher with the Avon-Maitland District School Board. Since 2007, his award-winning local history column has appeared regularly in the Huron County papers, including The Focus, Godric Signal Star, and several others. His newest booklet, Admiral Henry Wolsey, Bayfield, RN, Master Chartmaker of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence, was released in October. Information about how you can order that book is available in the email with the link to join the presentation this evening. David and his wife, Catherine, live in Godric, where they raise their 3 kids, and is very pleased to join us this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome David Yates, our presenter for this evening, to the screen. Over to you, David. You'll need to unmute first. Then
Well,
share your screen when you're ready.
Okay. Well, happy National Puppy Day. Okay, now, are we seeing that? Can you see it?
I can see you. I don't see your presentation yet, if that's what you're wondering.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm wondering. And okay, how's that? Okay, well, happy National Puppy Day. Michelle, I see you have a little fellow in the background reminding us it's Puppy Day. Thank you, Robert and Michelle, for that introduction. And it's my pleasure to be here tonight. I'm in the next little while, I'm going to talk about one of the most extraordinary persons in Canadian history in the 19th century, somebody who's kind of fallen through the cracks over the last 150 years. But I would argue that his legacy is just as important, just as significant as David Thompson, the master map maker on land. Henry Wolsey Bayfield is basically responsible for charting the the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and making it a safe and navigable seaway, as we'll see as we go on tonight. Anyway, first of all, he was born in Bayfield at Kingston upon Hull in Norfolk, same place where Lord Nelson was born. His parents were John and Eliza Bayfield. And the Bayfields were déclassé. They were the lower gentry who were kind of on their way out. They were in reduced straits. And that kind of explains why they sent their oldest son the age of, he wasn't quite 11 when he entered the Royal Navy as a supernumerary volunteer aboard the HMS Pompey. And six hours out of port, aboard the Pompey out of Portsmouth Harbor, he saw his first action. Imagine being not quite 11 years old and seeing your first action, your naval action, when they saw off a French privateer. There's a picture there of Bayfield Hall. It's in Norfolk. The family, Bayfield himself never lived there, but that's the ancestral family home. Now, when the time that Bayfield entered the Royal Navy, it was just months after Lord Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar. And I don't know, and he encounters, when he's on board the Pompey, none other than Lord Collingwood, who next to Nelson was probably Britain's greatest naval hero. And the Navy that Bayfield joined in the early 19th century was very much an elite service. Unlike Churchill's adage that the Royal Navy at the time was a mix of rum, sodomy, and the lash. And if you look at the old movies like Mutiny on the Bounty, they're kind of like the Royal Navy you'd think was a floating concentration camp. But actually, as I said, it was an elite service. It was a service that knew what it was doing, highly professional. And when Bayfield came aboard ship and joined the Royal Navy, the morale was high. Discipline was harsh. It had to be. You've got hundreds of men living on a very cramped quarters in a small ship. Discipline was tough. Flogging was a common form of punishment. But in addition to all that, a lot of seamen, boy seamen and midshipmen in particular, remember it was a lot of fun. There was the excitement of life at sea and being part of something bigger than yourself. The other thing the young Bayfield he probably knew his numbers and letters before he joined the Royal Navy. But while he was in the Navy, he was introduced to a variety of academic, intellectual subjects that were taught to him by other officers. And in some ships, they even had a sailing master teacher, basically, a schoolmaster that was aboard ship to teach young seamen such subjects as languages, geography, geometry, trigonometry, astronomy. It's amazing. He was a real autodidact. He learned how to speak Latin and Greek or the languages because he was able. He really was a truly remarkable person in his own education. Not only did he learn the ropes of sailing a king's warship, but he was introduced to awful lot of subjects, and he read widely. In the time that he had cruising around, most ships had a well-stocked library, and he made full use of it. By all accounts, Bayfield took to the sea like a duck to water. And in his early days, he fought several naval actions. Between 1806 and 1809, he was aboard the HMS Beagle. It was nicknamed the Golden Beagle because it had a knack of capturing prizes. And as you know, as some of you are probably aware, most naval officers didn't live on their naval pay. They were expected to capture prizes. The idea wasn't to sink ships, it was to capture them. And then you'd haul the prize into the nearest port. You'd sell the prize into cargo, and the money derived from that went to the crew based on rank and ability and what they'd done in the action. Bayfield was on board some very lucky ships that captured a lot of prizes, and no doubt it helped improve the family's financial straits, and no doubt enhanced their status as part of the gentry. Bayfield was promoted to first class volunteer. He was rated or promoted first class volunteer. And in April 1809, probably his most significant naval action was at the Battle of the Basque Roads in the Bay of Biscay. Bayfield's ship was under the command of Lord Thomas Cochrane, who some of you might have heard of. He was a legendary swashbuckler. The Beagle only had 18 guns, pardon me. It was a small ship, small sloop, 18 guns, and Bayfield volunteered his ship to sail behind the British fire ships. The British set several of their own ships on fire and sailed them into the Basque Roads on the Bay of Biscay. The idea was to break up the French fleet. Bayfield's was the first ship behind the fire ships. And amazingly, this is a test of the elite character of the Royal Navy at the time. His 18-gun boat engaged with much larger ships, and he's credited the Beagle as commander of the Beagle when it sailed into the Basque Roads. He's credited with forcing the Eagle, French ship of 74 guns, of striking its colors. He was able to get behind the Beagle's stern, and with his guns, he fired for 30 minutes. He fired devastating broadside and the broadside from literally stern to stem, wreaked terrible damage on the Beagle in 30 minutes. He sailed back and forth, brought it about, sailed back and fired into the rear of the stern of the Beagle, and he forced it to strike its colors. Bayfield wrote his mother it's probably the only firsthand account written by a junior officer of that battle, but he wrote his mother what happened that day. And he said it was a glorious day for England and the Navy. And for his bravery that day, Bayfield was promoted to master's mate. Interestingly, the one thing he didn't mention to his mom, that he was one of the seamen who was wounded in that action. But he's doing well in the Royal Navy. He's certainly a sea warrior in the tradition of Nelson. And after Napoleon was exiled in 1814, Bayfield volunteered for the North American Sea Service. He patrolled for a while the U.S. seaboard, looking for more prizes. And then he was posted to Lake Champlain. He missed out on the Battle of Lake Champlain, but the War of 1812 ended before he saw any action on the inland lakes. In March 1815, he had been promoted to lieutenant or lieutenant, and he came under the notice of somebody who would have the most profound influence on his career, Captain William Fitzwilliam Owen. And he saw in Bayfield in the winter of 1815-1816 helped Owen surveying between Quebec and Eastern Ontario. He kept Bayfield on the upper lakes to assist in his hydrographic or lake survey work around Kingston. Owen taught Bayfield the surveyor's trade and was impressed with his meticulous note keeping and his skills as a hydrographer. Bayfield has, and you can see it on the Library and Archives Canada, he kept a 91-page hand-scribbled set of notes, really, really concise, meticulous notes and drawings on instructions on how to do hydrographic work. It really was amazing. Owen, as the Naval Service, Owen was based in Kingston, where you are there now. Owen, the Naval Service was reduced, but Owen wanted to keep Bayfield, who was a much junior officer, on the seniority list. He wanted to keep him on in the service. And so Bayfield was ordered aboard the HMS Star in March 1816 to make a running survey of the north shores of Lake Erie and Ontario. Bayfield thought saw himself as a fighting officer. Bayfield saw himself or thought he wasn't very enthusiastic about being kept on the upper lakes. He thought that what he was doing would be what he called the burial of his career. But actually, the hydrographic service, the Royal Navy, was an elite part of the service. Okay, they were given extra pay, and they only wanted the most competent, able, intelligent officers to draw up charts and measure the coastlines of the world's oceans and land masses and stuff like that. And in fact, even though he thought it was a burial of his career, his greatest service was about to begin. And in March 1816, while he's in surveying the Niagara River, Owen came to him and said, I've been recalled. They're reducing the naval establishment further in the upper lakes. I've been recalled, but you at the age 21 are now the Admiralty Surveyor of the Great Lakes, a much vaunted title. And they decommissioned the Star, by the way. The Star was decommissioned, I think, in that fall. And so Bayfield, or 1870, Bayfield had this much vaunted title, but no ship. They had two small vessels built, open top, two-masted vessels called the Troughton, that he named the Troughton and Ramsden after instrument makers in England. And he was given one assistant, a midshipman. He was 15 years old, Philip Collins, to assist him with survey work. Bayfield must have had a change of mind about what his duties were, because he wrote the Admiralty that without hesitation, he accepted the employment proposed. And at the end of the War of 1812, the British really had no idea, or the Americans for that matter. No one really had idea of the precise location and of the Great Lakes, especially the upper lakes here in Michigan and Superior. Bayfield's charts would be the first hydrographic charts of the Great Lakes. And as you know, I'll mention Kingston again. The hydrographic office was headquartered in Kingston, and that's where the season's field notes were taken, and they were put down on chart paper, plotted on chart paper, and then sent back to England to be engraved. If you see that picture at the bottom there, that painting, that's actually Bayfield's sketch of Kingston Harbor in 1819. And Sir Edmund Wiley Grier, that's where that comes from. Bayfield has a pen and ink sketch that is this harbor, and most people concede that Sir Edmund there, he copied or painted from Bayfield's pen and ink sketch. So he's set out to do an Admiralty survey. Now remember, it's a defensive survey, it's a military survey. He wasn't thinking about opening up the inland waterways, the settlement, at least not yet. That would come later. But when he was set about to survey the Great Lakes, it was a military thing, because he was asked to position ideal spots or identified ideal spots for fortifications, harbors, and that sort of thing. After the war of 1812, both the Americans and the British wanted to know, okay, well, what do we have here so they could establish a boundary? And as I said, initially, little thought was given to inland settlement. That came later. So in the lower lakes, it was only Bayfield and Midshipman Collins and a few boatmen that they hired to help survey the lakes. They were nothing more than cramped, small, open-top vessels that were used in their survey work, and their instruments were incredibly primitive. And I'll talk about them in a second. But by the fall, I mean, it's remarkable what they did. By the fall of 1817, Bayfield's St. Clair River, and they surveyed the western shore of Lake Huron that fall before they came across around the tip of the Bruce Peninsula and went into Penetanguishene, where there was a naval base there. And I said they used only the rudimentary instruments. They had they would have only had a sextant. They would have had a lead line, a surveyor's chain, prism, and a theodolite, and a chronometer. And what they did, oh yeah, and he also had a really primitive sounder so that he can take the depth or sound the depth of the lake at certain parts. But there are two open top vessels that Collins and Bayfield used. One would have the theodolite at the shore at a stationary position. Collins would row markers out along the lake, and they'd take sections or shots with the theodolite, and they put wooden stakes, drive wooden stakes at regular intervals, 6-foot wooden pine stakes into the shoreline at where the water met the land, and they take sections. And then they take that back, and using a chronometer, they calculate their precise location on the surface of the earth. And it's remarkable how accurate their charts were, even by today's tech. I mean, we have GPS, but up until GPS, not they're remarkable accuracy. These are Bayfield's charts. This is his of Lower Lake Huron. And if you could superimpose a modern map of that, it'd be exactly the same. It's really remarkable that the charting that they were able to do, the accuracy. And it would have been extremely tedious, meticulous work that everything had to be precise. It was remarkable. And they did Lower Lake Huron very quickly. And in 1818, they started on the Georgian Bay. And that was the most difficult part of the survey. It took them about 4 seasons to survey Georgian Bay. And when one report to the Admiralty, Bayfield wrote that in one 10-week stretch, the party had ascertained, you could read the shape, size, and situation of upwards of 6,000 islands, flats, and rocks. In total, over 20,000 islands were plotted on the Lake Huron survey, particularly the Georgian Bay survey alone. It was the most difficult part of the survey. And I have to thank Peter Rindlisberg for the use of, this is Penetanguishene in about 1818, about the time that Bayfield would have hauled up here and wintered here for the winter. Bayfield's expedition kind of headquartered, went from Kingston to Penetanguishene, where they spent their winters, plotting the charts or the calculations that they had done over the field notes that they'd done over the summer months. Okay. And in the Georgian Bay survey, Bayfield's tiny party endured the extremes of heat, cold, tempestuous. If you've ever sailed, a lot of you are sailors, if you ever sailed on Georgian Bay, you got to marvel at how they were able in 2 small, tiny open top vessels to navigate the waters and then plot all the islands, the countless islands, flats, rocks, shoals in the water. And at the same time, they talk about clouds of mosquitoes that darkened the air, and they suffered terrible from ague, like fever, chills. They were afraid of scurvy because they were away for so long. They had to take 25 days they tried to take 25 days of supplies at a time, and then they'd send or hire out courier de bois, and that they go to Detroit or Penetanguishene to get more supplies and bring them back. But interestingly, in this area, it would have been the Ojibwa, or what we used to call the Chippewa natives. They were very supportive of the expedition. The Chippewa in this area during the War of 1812, they helped capture Fort Michilimackinac in the north of Lake Huron, and in the south, Detroit. They were instrumental in that, and they were instrumental in helping Bayfield's party because they would rather have the British than the Americans occupying the Great Lakes. And in fact, according to legend, Bayfield could speak at least he had I wouldn't say speak fluently, but he had a working knowledge of at least Ojibwa or Chippewa. And the natives in turn referred to him as Bayfield as Big Chief and Collins as Little Chief. And as I said, they suffered sickness quite a bit, but the natives kind of made up for the deficiency in their diet. Fish was plentiful, but they also got game and other. They were supplied by the natives quite amply. And Bayfield, and for reasons unknown, Bayfield in 1847, Bayfield destroyed his journals his daily journal on the Great Lakes and the first couple of years of the St. Lawrence for reasons we don't know, but he said he destroyed them. But they seem to have, as I said, the cooperation with the natives who provided them with food and added intelligence about what the Americans were doing. As I said, the indigenous peoples, at least here, saw the Crown as an ally against the US. And so they seem to have supported Bayfield's survey expedition. Like, I mean, if they didn't support it, he couldn't have lasted long out here. And you might know that defending North America, or this part of North America, was incredibly difficult. So the British were very grateful for the help that the natives, indigenous peoples were given. I had a quote earlier, but the Duke of Wellington encapsulated perfectly in one sentence the problem of Canadian defense. When at the time, and the Duke of Wellington was one of Canada's most fervent supporters in Parliament, but he said that defending Canada was all frontier and nothing else. And in that one sentence, he encapsulates the dilemma that any defense planners had about how do we defend the Canadian frontier. The Lake Superior Survey in 1823, he began the Bayfield, the Lake Superior 23, and despite the rental of the Hudson Bay Company vessel Recovery, they went back to their two small open boat vessels. They were faster and I guess they were more mobile and easier to get in and out of tight spots. The Recovery was used mostly as a supply vessel. While in the Lake Superior Survey, Bayfield collected a lot of the rock and wildlife samples. Some of them were sent to the British Museum in London, and he wrote, Commander Bayfield, he's a commander now, wrote the outlines of geology of Lake Superior, which was a pioneering work. It's the first work on the geology of Lake Superior, and he knew all the Latin words for the rocks and in that paper he just demonstrates a tremendous grasp of geologic science. And he was the first European, he and Collins were the first Europeans to actually circumnavigate Lake Superior. The Hudson Bay Company was instructed to give him their utmost cooperation, the Bayfield's party, the utmost cooperation. And some of the famous people that Bayfield meets on the Upper Lakes here is David Thompson. David Thompson was part of the Boundary Commission that was established by the Americans and the British after the War of 1812 to establish the North American boundary. Bayfield probably met Thompson on Lake Huron a couple of years before, but we do know that he met Thompson on Lake Superior, and the two of them exchanged pleasantries and information regarding their respective missions. Bayfield was instructed that if he was to encounter Americans, especially Americans in authority, like American military or naval officers, he was to withdraw immediately, not cause a fuss, but report it to authorities. He didn't meet that. He was able to successfully survey the circumference of Lake Superior. The other person that he meets in May 1825 in the last season on the Great Lakes was none other than Captain John Franklin, who was setting out on his second and overland expedition to the Arctic. Sir John went up through Penetanguishene and he went overland. He went up to the Arctic and he established that indeed there was a Northwest Passage. He mapped out, I think, several hundred miles of the northwest coast of the coast of the Northwest Passage. And of course, he went on. That was probably his most successful expedition because only about half his crew died. Of course, he went on to greater fame 20 years later. So, after the Lake Superior survey is done, he goes back to the United Kingdom, and he expected to be placed on half pay. Like most officers without a mission in the post-Napoleonic era, he expected to go on pensioned off on half pay. But at his own suggestion, he thought a survey of the St. Lawrence Seaway might be in order. The Admiralty must have been thinking the same thing because he was promoted and tasked with the St. Lawrence River Survey and Gulf Survey in 1827. About a day after he submitted his proposal, it was accepted, which means they were probably already thinking the same thing. And it's a good thing that he did because Bayfield had noticed that the earlier charts done in the 1770s and 80 they're incredibly inaccurate. In fact, Anticosti Island was 1 degree of latitude off compared to where it actually is. One of the things locally, I'm in Goderich right now, which is on Lake Huron. And locally, he's important because Bayfield's charts were used by the Canada Company to determine settlement on the eastern shore of Lake Huron and what became Huron County, or the Huron Tract. But on the St. Lawrence Survey, he begins his survey out of Quebec City in 1827, and it was one of the most busy waterways in the world, but there were 200 miles of uncharted waterways. And he was given enough money to build a 2-masted survey ship, 146-ton Gulnair, and it was the first of 3 survey ships, the last being a steam-powered vessel, that Bayfield used in the next 30 years. And you could read his authorized strength that he was allowed to hire. It was a mix of Royal Navy personnel, but mostly Canadian boatmen. And the Canadian boatmen would cause him no end of trouble on his survey expeditions. And we'll talk about that later. But there he is. Really quickly, Bayfield survey charts were eagerly anticipated by St. Lawrence Seaway pilots. It was not, according to the Royal Hydrographic Office's, the Royal Navy's Hydrographic Office's instructions, not only were the charts to be accurate, they were to be aesthetically pleasing, so that any pilot or ship's captain would be pleased to lay them out, proud to lay them out on their table. And Bayfield did both. He spends the next, he spends the next, I think 11 years surveying out of Quebec City. And when Lord Durham arrived, Lord Durham was so impressed with him that he asked for a complete set of Bayfield's charts. One of the other things, Gros Isle, which is where the a lot of the immigrants coming into Quebec were quarantined because of the fear of cholera and pox and everything else. It was Bayfield who recommended Gros Isle, 30 miles downriver of Quebec City, as that spot. Aboard Bayfield's vessels, the working conditions were harsh. Crew discipline were constant problems. Drunkenness was a constant problem, being so close to shore. Shore establishments, shore ports was always a problem. And when they weren't near shore port, they were on some of the most inhospitable shorelines on the Labrador coast and in Newfoundland, anywhere in the world. And as I said, he always was dealing with crew issues. And we'll talk about that in a sec. In 1833, he has this remarkable encounter with none other than John James Audubon. And the Audubon Expedition accidentally ran into Bayfield's hydrographic expedition on the Labrador coast. And at first glance, you might think that Audubon, the man of the rugged man of the wilderness, eschewing all forms of discipline and hierarchy, and that's how he portrayed himself, they would not be a very good match with Bayfield, the highly disciplined Royal Navy officer that kind of revered hierarchy, order, and discipline. But actually, they got on famously, to the point that they had several. They accompanied each other's ships, the Gulnair and the Audubon Expedition ships, and their officers exchanged greetings. The 4th of July, they kind of toasted each other, the king and the president, and in a lot of ways, they were kindred spirits because they both shared a reverence for nature. Both Bayfield and Audubon shared a reverence for nature. Bayfield was fascinated by flora, fauna, wildlife. And actually, Bayfield makes a quote at some point. He said that, human activity is going to destroy this pristine natural environment. Both men were artists, documenting their surroundings in unique ways. Of course, Audubon, through his wildlife paintings, that the Birds of America, the folio series, the Birds of America, and Bayfield through his meticulously crafted navigational charts. Bayfield referred to Audubon as a superior person, and one of Audubon's most famous paintings, the Common Loon, was presented to Audubon. The loon itself was presented. Funny enough, they were reverenced nature, but they didn't mind blasting a few birds to kind of Audubon and to kind of so that they could paint. And one of those birds was the Common Loon, which has become one of Audubon's signature paintings, was presented to Audubon by one of Bayfield's officers. And as it's one of the most famous images from Birds of America. It was the last leg, the Labrador and Newfoundland coast were the last leg of Audubon's expeditions looking for the birds of America. Okay, so Bayfield, on the personal note, Bayfield was active in the small, in Quebec City, was active in the city's small English garrison social life. He was a founding member and he was a chair of the Quebec Literary and Historical Society. He presented papers at their annual dinner. During the rebellion, of course, he's a British naval officer, so he offered his services to the Governor General to suppress the rebellion. And in 1838, he married Fanny Amelia Wright. She was the daughter of a Royal Engineer colonel who would later rise to the rank of Major General. And she was much younger than him. He was born in 1795, and she was probably born about 1813. There's some 1812 or 1813 or something, but he would have been a good catch. You know, the painting of Bayfield here isn't authored, but Amelia, or Fanny rather, Amelia, she was an artist, musician, and teacher, and she became a famous artist in her own right, painting Victoria, like the flora and fauna of PEI in Quebec City. This painting here of the young Bayfield, it's not, the artist's name isn't on it, but I suspect Fanny painted it. It's about the time, it's a very flattering portrait of Bayfield. It would have been about the time that they were married or engaged or something like that. And I suspect Fanny painted that portrait of her husband or her husband to be. So, and then they would have several sons and 2 daughters. And that, by the way, that's her, Fanny's painting of Quebec City in 1835. And you can tell the influence of the Royal Engineers. That's almost like a Royal Engineers painting, very precise, accurate with the geology and that sort of thing. And that was, that's her. And she did several others of Quebec, the Citadel and that sort of thing. So in 1848, Bayfield moves because they pretty much surveyed the St. Lawrence River itself. And so the survey moves to Charlottetown and PEI, where Bayfield surveys the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And he, as I said, they surveyed the remainder of the Labrador coast, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Cape Breton. His last real survey work was on Halifax Harbor. And the only part of the survey he didn't do in the Maritimes was the New Brunswick coast. They married up the 2 surveys and an elaborate means later, but he didn't, the only part of the Maritimes he didn't do was the New Brunswick coast. Bayfield was a stern disciplinarian, but he never resorted to the lash. He had a real aversion to the lash. He led by example. Bayfield endured the same extremes of climate and harsh conditions as the rest of his crew. His preferred method of punishment was the stoppage of the rum ration, which he believed, probably rightly, caused most of the discipline problems. The harshest thing he did, and it shows that his reverence for nature, he gave explicit instructions to his crew not to sprit sailing dogfish, or which was what they called a shark there. And what sprit sailing was, when the sharks were leaping out of the water, a seaman would take a sprit, which is like a stave on board a ship to support a sail, and they kind of spear the shark through the gills and let the shark really struggle. The shark couldn't submerge. And Bayfield hated that practice. He knew sailors didn't like sharks, and he gave explicit orders not to do that. One seaman did that, and when the officer of the watch reprimanded him and the seaman took the shark and threw it on the deck, Bayfield came aboard and clapped the man in irons and had him put him under arrest, and he basically discharged him at the nearest whaling station, where he would have had to find his way home. As I said, he was a stern disciplinarian, and he didn't mind. A young midshipman complained about the open sea voyage between Cape Breton Island and Prince Edward Island, wrote him a note saying he thought the conditions weren't befitting of an officer of the crown. And Bayfield reprimanded him, saying that when he was much older, he endured much more difficult conditions, and he expected his officers and crew to do the same, especially as officers. But in 1856, Bayfield. He retires from active sea service, and he's given the rank of Rear Admiral. He still stays on the supplementary order list, and he's promoted right up to full admiral. And he lives out the rest of his life in Charlottetown as what one newspaper called our most distinguished citizen. This is Bayfield's house in Charlottetown. I visited there last October. And a late in life portrait of Bayfield said he was a man of high religious principles, kind to the poor and disposed to aid every good work, whose noble Christian example did much in past years to exert a beneficial influence on the higher circles of our city. And he, as he got older, and probably his wife's influence, he became more religious. He had a sense of humor. If you read, he's got a really dry wit. He had a really dry sense of humor, and he talks about being in an Anglican confirmation class when he was retired with kids that were 13 and 14, and he worried about the bad influence that he was setting for those kids. But anyway, he was kidding, I think. But anyway, Bayfield dies, and actually, sadly, the last few years of his life, he was confined to the attic, basically to one room in the house, because he became infirm, frail. He couldn't walk any longer, and so he was basically confined in a wheelchair to the upstairs in the house. He lived out, and he died in 1885, and he's buried in the old Protestant burying ground in Charlottetown. There's his headstone. There's a story behind that I won't get into tonight, but he and his wife Fanny and their daughter Helen, she died in 1867, the three of them are buried there. Before Bayfield died, he had the honor of seeing that Canada's first hydrographic survey vessel was named after him in 1883, and from 1883 to 1993. There have been 4 Canadian hydrographic survey vessels named Bayfield. He lived a gentleman's life in retirement. He was granted a 150-pound pension in addition to his naval pension. And in 1867, he was promoted to full admiral. He was on the supplementary order list. And in one Admiralty report, he wrote that of Canada, I love the country and feel for its welfare. And sadly, he died at the age of 90 on February 10th, 1885. Another son predeceased him. Actually, one son followed him into the Navy, and he died of yellow fever on station in the Caribbean when he was, I think he was only about 19 or 20. And another son, his other daughter married into the Cunard family, Sir Sam Cunard's family, the famed shipping magnate. They were originally from Nova Scotia and went to England. And anyway, he had an extraordinary 90-year life and a tremendous impact on Canadian history, navigation, and he's somebody that I think is well worth remembering. There's been no full-length biography done of Admiral Bayfield's life, which is extraordinary. And there's his legacy. Spent 40 years mapping Canada's vast coasts and waterways. In 1867, of the 215 charts the Admiralty had issued for Canadian waters, 114 of them were drafted by Bayfield. And there's over 30 villages, geographic features, provincial parks named after him in Bayfield, Wisconsin. And in fact, including near us, just about 10 miles south of me, is the village of Bayfield, who, by the way, the Bayfield Historical Society commissioned me to do this work on Bayfield. So, as I said, and I kind of like this. This is in his survey notes. This is a self-portrait of him, I'm guessing about 18, 20. He did a little bit of sense of humor. But I don't think his achievements have ever been acknowledged beyond the Admiralty, but he deserves a place in history, in our history, Canadian history, on a par with Thompson and Franklin and some of the others. So that concludes my talk. And if you're interested in learning more about Admiral Bayfield, there's some shameless advertising there. And if you have any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them if I can.
Easy. Thank you very much, David. That was a wonderful presentation. I definitely kept remarking along as you were showing those charts and kind of explaining the amount of time it took to kind of work their way through it. That, I mean, that seems like it doesn't seem like very much time, to be honest, for the amount of work some of us may know would be involved in the length of that coast, especially when you're thinking about Lake Superior. Having felt like it took me a week to drive across the North Shore, but it's quite remarkable when you think about really how, in my mind, anyways, how little time it actually took them to chart it out. That's how my impression of it, anyways.
And how accurate they were.
Yes, yes.
They were very accurate, precise.
Yeah.
And they did those calculations by hand, figuring them out with a pencil and no calculators.
It was they had it down to a science. They certainly did. Yeah. So just to remind everyone, if you would like to submit any questions, you're welcome to do that using the YouTube chat. You're also welcome to send them by email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. I have put that email address in the chat, but it is marmus@marmuseum.ca. Caramel's itchy to get celebrating. But we have a couple questions that have come in throughout the chat. Get one read off here, and then I'll pipe down the puppy. There was, I guess, a question relating to the theodolite. Perhaps you could talk a bit more about it. We understand it has to do with supporting with triangulation.
That's right. As a navigate, let me see. I think I've got a picture of it here. Let me see if I can find it. The theodolite was to help with azimuths and angles. There's a transit. Oh, maybe I don't have the theodolite when it's in the book, but the theodolite was basically, it had a little telescope on it, and it had the angles around it had the degrees of like, and I used to survey and had the angles, and they'd shoot kind of like line through it, and they'd sight the prism, that sort of thing with the theodolite. And it had the degrees on it. You could spin it around and get a back shot. You could shoot where you came from, and you hope that if it was 180 degrees that way, it'd be, or if it was 90 degrees that way, it'd be 180 degrees behind you. No, 270 degrees, that sort of thing. It helped you find your location, and it helped you map out with the prism. They had a little prism that you'd rock back and forth, and the theodolite or transit would look through the prism, and they try to hit the line with the prism. And when the theodolite would try to calculate like the line of, or the degrees and that sort of thing. I'm not explaining it very well, but it's a very good question. I have a picture of it and how it works in the book there, but good question. I didn't explain it very well.
So there you have it. You need to purchase.
But it's an instrument, a survey instrument with a telescope, and it's got 360 degree circle underneath it, and you could use it on a portable station, like on a tripod. You put it on and you move it around, and you want to sight, okay, if you got the prism angle there and you want to sight another spot there, and you can calculate the angle. Terrible explanation.
Oh, I think you did pretty well. So the follow-up to that was, so if one can't see the opposite shore, for instance, in Superior, how do they measure the distance to it?
The opposite shore? Well, they couldn't see the opposite shore, but what they did is, that's where the chronometer comes in. And don't ask me how the chronometer works, but the chronometer is an incredibly accurate timepiece. And when they can calculate the time, they can also calculate what line of latitude they're on and that sort of thing, so that when they took the notes, they'd measure it off the chronometer where the distance, and then they could calculate distance and the elevations and that sort of thing. And that's about as good as I can get on that.
I think, quite honestly, we're simply going to have a museum program that
goes through.
It's going to take you through exactly how to do this kind of thing, because I had a chronometer sitting on my desk about a month ago. I put it somewhere for safekeeping, and now I can't remember where it is. But it's certainly, I'm going to program to add to my ideas list.
This is how important that chronometer was. The one thing that Bayfield and Franklin's chronometer, by the time he got to Fort William, Franklin's chronometers were broken. The crystals were broken on the chronometer, and they weren't working right. So Bayfield gave him his. so that you can carry on his survey. But the chronometer is how you plot your location. Once you know where your location is and you take the measurements from that location, the benchmark, you can calculate distances and that sort of thing. But I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of calculations they do in a winter season. Like they put them in their notes and plot them on graphs, and it's really, really meticulous work. And I wish I could do it justice.
We'll get our mathematician slash.
Yeah, I mean, there's somebody out there that would probably know more.
Right.
Could explain that better.
Okay, so the next one's more of a comment. It was simply a note that on the 1996 copy of CHS chart 2286, it covers a large area around the North Channel, states, quote, a portion engraved taken from a survey by Lieutenant Bayfield, 1822. So just all people picking up on the name, I think, starting to recognize the connections that they've made in the past that they might not quite realize. Some
of Bayfield's charts just came up for sale at an auction in Sault Ste. Marie, and the Bayfield Historical Society is looking. A lot of these charts were printed, so they're out there. And if you've got a Bayfield chart, I know people who are looking for it. And the North Channel was a popular chart. There's no doubt that was a tricky place to navigate. And he took particular care about the North Channel. He writes about that.
Okay, a couple more questions. Is Bayfield Bay on Wolf Island named after him? Any idea?
Yes, it is.
There we go.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the first steamship he employed on the St. Lawrence?
That he employed?
Yes.
It was the Gulnair. It was the last survey vessel. Gulnair.
That was a steamship?
The last one was a steamship. It was called the Gulnair.
Okay.
Last Gulnair, all the steamship, his survey ships were named Gulnair, and the last one was a steamship. Right. And I can't remember. I could probably look it up. I can't remember what exact year that steamship was built, but the first one, they all outlived their usefulness, and they were sold to merchant mariners. And the Gulnair, I'm not sure what the fate is, but the Gulnair, the last of them, it was a steam vessel. But he never used a steam vessel when he was surveying the St. Lawrence River. The Gulf of St. Lawrence, yes, but he never used a steam vessel when he was surveying the St. Lawrence River, just the Gulf, just out in the Gulf itself.
Okay. There's a couple comments here about experiencing some of the frustration that Bayfield would have experienced with respect to mosquitoes around the North Channel.
Yes.
Maurice talking about his excursions upon Pathfinder. That's a lot of recognition in that aspect of it. A couple others here. Was Captain Owen the namesake for Owen Sound?
Yep.
Yep.
Actually, or his brother, the two Owen brothers. But yeah, I think it was that Fitzwilliam Owen was, yeah, he was an interesting character too. He was a stern disciplinarian. In fact, one of his actions started the famous mutiny in the Nore in 1797. But he went on, he was kind of an eccentric, but he went on and became really active in the anti-slave trade. He was a real militant abolitionist. He became really, as I said, he was really active in the anti-slave trade. In fact, he surveyed part of the coast of Africa, and one of his missions was to intercept slave traders, slave trading vessels, which is part of the Royal Navy's mission in the early 19th century. And he was a really militant anti-slave activist. He had a really profound sense of social justice, just not with his own crew sometimes.
Okay, we got here, I guess when we're talking about going back to the theodolite, I guess it was just like confirmation about we were talking about the position having to do with the chronometer. Was that the position was mapped by the North Star? Would that be true?
Yeah, that would have been what, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it would have been the North Star. The Southern Hemisphere would have been the Southern Cross, and they would have had other constellations that they could have marked their position with. But Polaris is really important. And the sextant, when you're at sea, when you're kind of marking and all that sort of thing. And I think there is a picture of it there.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap up here. So is there any conjecture on why he burned his journal?
No, it could be just his wife said, you got too much of this crap lying around the house, get rid of it. But I have no idea. A lot of what we know about the Great Lakes come to him from his letters to the Admiralty, where he talks about conditions on the Great Lakes, like the mosquitoes and that sort of thing. And he's writing to the Admiralty, but we have no idea why he destroyed his papers. And that's what kind of, I think, has made it so difficult to write a full-length biography of him. And in fact, he destroys the first 2 years of his St. Lawrence Seaway journals. We have no idea why he did that, but he does make a point of telling, he was a captain that wrote a little art, who knew him, who wrote an article about him, and he said that Bayfield told him he destroyed his papers, his Great Lakes paper. What does exist are his 91-page survey notes, instructions on how to survey, and they just reading through them, he like I said, it's all handwritten, really tightly cribbed. He has everything you can encounter on hydrographic work on the Great Lakes, he puts in those 91 pages. And that's where his little self-portrait was.
Imagine that. So I think the last question I've answered, but to confirm that the book was released in October, so it's available now through either Bayfield Historical Society website, correct?
That's right. The Bayfield Historical Society. Oh, there it is.
If the link was provided in the email with the email that was sent around with the link to join the presentation this evening. So that information is there for you. And I guess the last comment here I see is simply Bayfield boats. So that kind of explains when you're getting back to Quebec City and the boats that he commissioned at the very beginning.
They used to be, yeah, the Bayfield boat, the survey vessels. Yeah, they were all named after him, in honor of him. And the last survey vessel, the Bayfield 4, was decommissioned, I think, about 1993. But there is down in Lake Ontario, there's the Bayfield Research Center that Coast Guard and Hydrographic, the wildlife people have, named after Henry Wolsey Bayfield. He was
all the connections come together.
Yeah, he was a naturalist. Besides a sailor, he was a naturalist, hydrographer, scientist, geologist, you name it, historian, everything.
I particularly like the connection with Audubon, having they're very popular books in my family. Growing up, was always looking at those series of books, and yeah, following back the original namesake, of course, everything having to do with the naturalists and Canadian, North American wildlife.
Yeah, and it was they formed a really close bond in the 2 months that they were together.
Well, I'm pause it on the questions. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them by email. I will make sure they get passed along to David, and he can get back to you by email. Thank you so much, David, for joining us this evening. It was a wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot, still learning a lot, and it was very nice to have you join us and share those extensive visuals that you have of the Great Lakes charts, and really helping us get a sense of how accurate they were with the technology they had at the time. It's absolutely remarkable. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The heads up for next one is on the 6th of April with called Underwater Canada with Jill Heinerth, who is an explorer in residence with the Royal Canadian Geographic Society. So we're going to continue with the naturals and the explorers. This seems to be the theme for the tail end of this series. I invite you to join us either at the Kingston Yacht Club or by YouTube. So the presentation will be live streamed, much like the one from last time, but we're going to work out all the technical difficulties we experienced and make sure that it's great start from start to finish. So thank you again so much for everyone for joining. If you'd like to join us for next time, please check out our website, marmuseum.ca, marmuseum.ca, and you'll find the information for the remaining part of the series. Thank you again, David, and thank you again, everyone, for joining.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening.
You too.
There we go. We're all done live stream.